coffin was beautiful, carved from rare cherrywood inlaid with mother-of-pearl lined with white silk. Daniel Mercer stood beside it, accepting condolences from a steady stream of mourners, all of whom spoke of his wife in the past tense, even though she stood just 10 meters away, watching her own funeral with a detached curiosity. "Grace was such a wonderful person," murmured an elderly woman, clasping Daniel's hand between her own. "Such a tragedy to lose her so young. Thank you, Mrs. Winters."
Daniel replied, his voice appropriately somber. "She always spoke fondly of you." The woman nodded and moved on, brushing past Grace without acknowledgement, as if she were invisible. Grace wasn't surprised. To Mrs. Winters and everyone else attending the funeral, Grace Mercer was dead. Her consciousness and memories wiped clean by the Ministry of Identity transition.
The woman who shared Grace's face, who stood observing the funeral in regulation white garments, was legally and socially a different person entirely. She just didn't know who that person was yet. The ceremony continued with practiced solemnity. A large portrait of Grace, the real Grace, according to society, stood beside the empty coffin surrounded by white lilies. Friends and colleagues stepped forward to share memories of a woman who now existed only in their recollections. Her academic achievements, her work in quantum computation, her marriage to Daniel. Grace listened with a strange detachment, like hearing a biography of someone vaguely familiar. These accomplishments belonged to her, yet not to her. The Grace being eulogized had been erased through the memory-cleansing protocol she had voluntarily undergone 3 days ago. Only the physical vessel remained, awaiting a new identity, a new life path, a new name. She studied Daniel as he received the mourners' condolences. Her husband, technically ex-husband, though they had never divorced. The law was clear. Identity transition severed all previous legal relationships. The woman who had been Grace Mercer was dead. The woman who would emerge from the transition center next week would be someone else entirely, with no legal connection to Daniel or anyone else from Grace's former life. Had he been crying? It was difficult to tell from this distance. Their final authorized interaction had been the formal separation interview 2 days before the memory cleansing, a sterile conversation in the presence of transition counselors designed to provide closure, while discouraging emotional attachments that might interfere with the transition process. "Your genetic legal designation will attend the ceremonial internment," the counselor had explained to Daniel in the precise neutral language required for such proceedings. "This provides social closure and reinforces the reality of transition for the community. However, direct interaction is prohibited." Daniel had nodded, his expression carefully controlled. "I understand the protocols." Grace had studied his face, then trying to memorize his features, even though she knew those memories would soon be erased. Had he truly accepted her decision? Their last private conversation had been tense, filled with unresolved emotions. Daniel couldn't understand why she had chosen transition, why anyone would voluntarily surrender their entire identity, their memories, their life. "There are other ways to start over," he had argued. "Relocation, career change, even divorce if that's what you want." But none of those options offered what Grace truly needed: complete liberation from her own mind, from the memories that haunted her, from the person she had become. Now she watched as the ceremony moved toward its conclusion. The ministry official stepped forward, his black uniform pristine, his voice carrying the weight of governmental authority. "Today we witness the completion of Grace Elizabeth Mercer's life journey. In accordance with the Voluntary Transition Act, her legal and social identity has been terminated. We honor her choice to release her consciousness and allow her physical vessel to serve a new identity as established in the renewal protocols." The gathered mourners murmured their ritual response. "We honor the sacrifice and welcome the renewal." Grace had attended similar ceremonies before, most recently for her colleague Amina, whose transition had partly inspired her own decision. These funerals without bodies had become commonplace since the Transition Act passed 8 years ago, offering citizens the legal right to erase their identities while preserving their physical forms for reassignment. The official reasons for the act were straightforward: addressing demographic imbalances, reducing suicide rates, providing second chances to those whose lives had become unbearable. The unofficial reality was more complex. Transition had become a solution for problems, ranging from criminal rehabilitation to severe psychological trauma, to simple, profound discontent. For Grace, it had been the memories, the constant intrusive remembrance of that night in the laboratory. The explosion, the screams, the knowledge that her calculations had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. 5 colleagues dead because of her mistake. 5 brilliant minds extinguished while she somehow had survived.
The investigation had cleared her of criminal negligence. A reasonable miscalculation in pioneering research, the review board had concluded. But Grace knew the truth that her equations had hidden. She had been impatient, had bypassed 3 recommended verification procedures in her eagerness to prove her theory. No punishment the justice system could devise would have matched the sentence her own mind imposed, remembering every day in perfect detail. The faces, the sounds, the knowledge of what she had done. Transition offered what nothing else could complete: erasure of those memories. The woman who would emerge from the transition center would have no knowledge of the accident, no guilt to carry. She would be in every meaningful way someone else. The ceremony concluded with the symbolic closing of the empty coffin. Daniel placed a single white rose on the polished wood, his fingers lingering for a moment before he stepped back. As the designated family representative, he would accompany the coffin to the memorial gardens, where it would be interred with full ceremonial honors, despite containing nothing but carefully selected mementos of Grace's former life. Grace herself would return to the transition center to continue her identity dissolution process. 5 more days of specialized treatments to ensure that no meaningful fragments of memory remained, followed by basic skills, retraining, and identity establishment. In 2 weeks, a new person would emerge. Same body, different consciousness, ready to begin life, with a ministry-assigned name and a carefully constructed background. As the mourners began to disperse, a transition officer approached Grace. "It's time to return to the center," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "The observation period has concluded." Grace nodded, taking one last look at Daniel as he stood beside the coffin, accepting final condolences. For a moment their eyes met across the distance and prohibited connection, a final farewell that the protocols couldn't quite prevent. Then she turned away, following the officer toward the waiting transport. Behind her, Grace Mercer's life officially ended. Ahead lay the uncertainty of becoming someone new. The transition center occupied a sprawling campus on the city's western edge, its modernist buildings surrounded by carefully maintained gardens designed to create an atmosphere of peaceful renewal. To the public, these grounds were accessible only through virtual tours and carefully regulated visitor areas. The inner facilities, where the actual transition processes occurred, remained shrouded in clinical privacy. Grace had been housed in the same room since her admission 10 days earlier, a space deliberately designed to feel transitional, with minimal personal touches and soothing, neutral decor. The medications she received 3 times daily had already begun erasing targeted memory centers, creating a hazy indistinctness around her personal history. "How was the ceremony?" asked Dr. Alvarez during their evening session. As Grace's primary transition physician, she monitored both the physical and psychological aspects of the memory erasure process. "Strange," Grace replied, searching for words to describe the experience. "Like watching a movie about someone else, except that someone was me." Dr. Alvarez nodded, making a note on her tablet. "That's a common response. The dissociation is partly a natural psychological defense mechanism, and partly an effect of the initial treatment phase. It helps create the cognitive distance necessary for complete transition. The people there, they really believe I'm dead." "In a meaningful sense, you are," Dr. Alvarez said gently. "Grace Mercer no longer exists as a continuous consciousness. The legal and social frameworks reflect this reality." Grace looked down at her hands, familiar yet increasingly foreign as her memories of them faded. "When does it happen? The complete erasure. Will I know when Grace is gone and whoever comes next begins?" "There's no single moment of transition," the doctor explained. "The process is gradual, designed to maintain fundamental cognitive functions, while systematically removing autobiographical memory and personality structures. By the final phase, conscious awareness of the previous identity will be gone, allowing for the establishment of the new identity framework." "But something remains, doesn't it? Some substrate. Otherwise, why not just let people die if they want to end their current existence?" Dr. Alvarez's expression remained professional, but Grace detected a slight hesitation. This wasn't the first time she had pushed against the carefully constructed narrative of transition. "Basic cognitive architecture remains," the doctor acknowledged. "Procedural memory, how to walk, talk, use language. Fundamental personality traits are partially preserved, though significantly modified. Think of it as keeping the instrument while playing an entirely different song." Grace wasn't satisfied with the metaphor. "But continuity of consciousness is interrupted."
Dr. Alvarez interjected firmly. The person you are now will not experience being the person who emerges. From your subjective perspective, Grace Mercer's existence ends. And what about from an objective perspective? Grace persisted. The doctor sighed slightly. These philosophical questions are natural at this stage of transition, but ultimately unhelpful. What matters is that legally and socially you are undertaking a complete identity transition. The consciousness that emerges will have no access to Grace Mercer's memories, no sense of being the same person. Grace nodded, though her doubts remained. The fundamental question at the heart of transition, whether it was truly a death and rebirth of identity, or merely an extreme form of amnesia, had been debated since the program's inception. The official position emphasized the former interpretation, but Grace had always been too analytical to accept convenient narratives. Now, Dr. Alvarez continued, changing the subject. Tomorrow we begin Phase 3 of the treatment. The memory suppression will intensify, and you'll experience increasing cognitive fluctuation. It's important that you report any unusual symptoms or unexpected memory retention. Will I still be coherent? Yes, though increasingly detached from your personal history. We maintain basic functionality throughout the process. You'll still be able to communicate, though your sense of self will become progressively more diffuse. Grace thought about the gradual dissolution of everything that made her who she was. The academic achievements, the relationships, even the guilt that had driven her to this choice, all fading away like writing on a beach as the tide comes in. What about the accident? She asked suddenly. The laboratory explosion. When will those memories go? Dr. Alvarez consulted her tablet. Those memories were flagged as primary transition motivators. They received targeted suppression in the initial phase and should already be significantly attenuated. Do you still have clear recall of those events? Grace tried to access the memories that had haunted her for months. The calculations, the warning signs she'd ignored the moment of catastrophic failure. To her surprise, they had already become indistinct, like scenes from a movie she'd watched long ago. They're fading, she admitted. I know the accident happened, but the details are blurry. That's the expected progression, Dr. Alvarez confirmed. By this time tomorrow, even the knowledge that an accident occurred will begin to dissipate. By the end of Phase 3, your awareness of being Grace Mercer, along with all associated memories, will be effectively erased. Grace felt a strange mixture of relief and loss. The guilt was already less acute, the constant replay of those terrible moments less vivid. This was what she had wanted: freedom from the memories that had made life unbearable. Yet as they receded, she felt a growing emptiness, an expanding void where her identity had been. What about Daniel? She asked the question, emerging before she could consider its implications. Dr. Alvarez's expression remained carefully neutral. Personal relationships are typically among the last memories to fully dissolve due to their deep emotional integration. However, by this time tomorrow, your connection to Daniel Mercer will be significantly diminished. By the end of transition, he will hold no special significance to your consciousness. Grace tried to imagine it looking at Daniel and seeing a stranger. The thought produced an unexpected pang of loss. Despite everything that had led her to transition, despite their complicated final months together, the prospect of forgetting him entirely felt like another kind of death. Is there... Grace hesitated, knowing she was approaching a boundary in the transition protocols. Is there any way to preserve certain memories? Not the accident, but other things. Good things. Dr. Alvarez's expression softened slightly with compassion. This is a common question at this stage. The answer remains no. Selective memory preservation undermines the fundamental purpose of transition complete identity dissolution. Cherry-picking memories would create a hybrid identity vulnerable to psychological fragmentation and identity confusion. Grace nodded, having expected this answer, but feeling the disappointment nonetheless. This was the bargain she had made: complete escape from the unbearable memories at the cost of everything else. The good along with the bad, the joy along with the pain. Rest now, Dr. Alvarez suggested, rising from her chair. Tomorrow's treatment will begin at 0900 hours. The attendants will bring your evening medication in 30 minutes. After the doctor left, Grace moved to the room's single window, which offered a view of the transition center's eastern gardens. The setting sun cast long shadows across the carefully maintained landscape, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed suddenly symbolic of her own fading consciousness. Somewhere beyond those gardens, beyond the center's secure perimeter, Daniel was returning from her funeral. What was he feeling? Grief. Relief. Anger at her choice to erase their life together. The protocols had limited their final conversations, leaving so much unsaid between them. Grace pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching as her breath created a momentary fog that distorted her view before fading away, much like her memories clouding and then disappearing, leaving nothing behind. The next morning arrived with a disorienting haziness. Grace woke to find herself struggling to recall basic details of her life. Her parents' names, the university where she'd studied, the street where she'd lived with Daniel. The medications were working more aggressively now, dissolving the connective tissue of her autobiographical memory. "Good morning," said the attendant who brought her breakfast, a young woman whose name Grace had known yesterday but now escaped her. "How are you feeling today?" "Disconnected," Grace answered honestly. "Like I'm becoming less." The attendant nodded as if this were a standard response. Phase 3 often feels that way. The identity dissolution is becoming more pronounced. Dr. Alvarez will be here after you've eaten to administer today's primary treatment. Grace looked down at the food, nutritionally balanced but deliberately bland. Another element of the transition protocol designed to minimize sensory connections to the past. As she ate, she tried to perform a mental inventory cataloging what remained of Grace Mercer in her consciousness. She still knew she was undergoing transition, still understood why, the laboratory accident, the death she had caused. But the emotional weight of those memories had diminished significantly, as if they had happened to someone else. Her academic knowledge remained largely intact, though the personal connections to that knowledge, when she had learned certain concepts who had taught her, were fading. Most disconcertingly, her sense of self was becoming increasingly fragmented. Who was Grace Mercer? What defined her beyond a collection of memories that were rapidly dissolving? The philosophical questions she had posed to Dr. Alvarez yesterday now felt urgently personal. After breakfast, 2 attendants escorted her to the treatment room, a clinical space dominated by advanced neurological equipment. Dr. Alvarez waited beside the central apparatus, a sophisticated neural interface system that would deliver targeted memory suppression with far greater precision than the medications alone. "Today's session will last approximately 3 hours, Dr. Alvarez explained as the technicians prepared the equipment. "You'll remain conscious throughout, though your awareness will fluctuate. The procedure is not painful, but many patients report a sensation of untethering." Grace nodded, allowing the technicians to help her onto the reclined treatment chair. As they attached monitoring sensors and positioned the neural interface above her head, she felt a sudden impulse to resist, a primal survival instinct reacting to the imminent dissolution of self. "It's normal to feel apprehensive," Dr. Alvarez said, noticing her tension. "Your consciousness is designed to preserve itself. But remember, this was your choice. The person you become will have new opportunities unburdened by the past that has caused you such pain." "But she won't be me," Grace said softly. Dr. Alvarez's expression remained compassionate but firm. "That is the purpose of transition." The neural interface activated with a soft hum, and Grace felt a warm, tingling sensation spread across her scalp. The room seemed to shift slightly, colors becoming more vivid while edges grew less distinct. The technical explanation, selective stimulation of certain brain regions while suppressing others, did little to capture the profound strangeness of the experience. "We'll begin with foundational identity structures." Dr. Alvarez's voice seemed to come from both nearby and very far away. "Personal history, formative relationships, educational progression." Images and sensations began to flow through Grace's consciousness. Her childhood home now indistinct around the edges, her parents' faces, features blurring. University classrooms where she had studied quantum theory, the specifics of her research dissolving into generalities. It wasn't like forgetting, not the frustrating search for information just beyond reach. It was more absolute, more final. These parts of her weren't becoming inaccessible. They were being unmade, erased from the neural pathways that had stored them. Time became fluid, stretching and compressing as the treatment progressed. Occasionally, Dr. Alvarez would ask questions to assess the dissolution progress. "Can you tell me your full name?" "Grace Elizabeth." The surname wouldn't come. "Where did you complete your doctoral studies?" A vague image of buildings but no name, no specific location. "What was your primary field of research?" "Quantum something with particles calculations." The precise area of expertise that had defined her professional identity was now reduced to generalities.
As the procedure continued, Grace felt herself becoming increasingly untethered from the person she had been. The few memories that remained felt distant, as if borrowed from someone else's life.
Even her emotional responses were changing. The grief and guilt that had driven her to transition now felt abstract, intellectual rather than visceral. And then unexpectedly a memory surfaced with startling clarity. Daniel laughing in early morning light, reaching across rumpled bedsheets to touch her face. The sensory detail was vivid. The warmth of sunlight, the texture of cotton against skin, the particular timbre of his laugh. "I'm detecting increased activity in the limbic region," one of the technicians reported, studying the neural monitoring display. "Strong emotional memory resurfacing. Adjust targeting parameters," Dr. Alvarez instructed. "Increase suppression in sectors 7 through 9. Grace tried to hold on to the memory as the machine recalibrated, but it was already fading, dissolving like sugar in water.
Daniel's face blurred, the sensory details attenuated, the emotional resonance diminished until only a vague impression remained. A profound sense of loss washed over her. Not just for Daniel, but for everything that constituted Grace Mercer. Her achievements, her mistakes, the complex web of experiences and relationships that had formed her identity, all disappearing, systematically erased to make room for someone new.
"We're approaching optimal dissolution thresholds," the technician reported. "Core identity structures at 27% integrity and declining." "Very good," Dr. Alvarez responded. "Maintain current parameters for the final phase." The untethering sensation intensified. Grace felt as if she were floating, disconnected from both her past and her physical form. The boundaries of selfhood that humans take for granted, the clear delineation between I and not I, began to blur. "What's happening?"
she managed to ask, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Phase 3 completion," Dr. Alvarez explained gently. "Your core identity structures are dissolving as planned. The process is working exactly as intended." Grace wanted to ask more questions, but the words wouldn't form properly. Language itself seemed to be shifting, the connection between concepts and their verbal expressions becoming tenuous.
The treatment room faded in and out of focus, time compressed and expanded,
and the sense of self, the continuous I that had been Grace Mercer, began to fragment into disconnected awareness. In a moment of clarity amid the dissolution, a single question formed. Was this death? Not biological termination, but the end of a specific consciousness, a particular way of experiencing and interpreting the world.
If the person who emerged from this process would have no memory of being Grace, no continuity of experience, wasn't this effectively the end of Grace Mercer's existence? The philosophical question she had posed to Dr. Alvarez now seemed urgently relevant but increasingly difficult to formulate as her cognitive processes altered. The distinction between transformation and termination blurred along with everything else. As the final phase of treatment progressed, even these metacognitive reflections began to fade. The neural interface hummed softly, methodically, erasing the last structures of identity, leaving only the basic cognitive architecture upon which a new consciousness would be constructed. The person on the treatment chair was still awake, still aware in some fundamental sense, but increasingly disconnected from the specific consciousness that had chosen to undergo transition.
Grace Mercer was nearly gone, her memories, personality, and self-concept dissolved by the precisely calibrated treatments. In her place remained something more basic, a consciousness without continuity, prepared for reintegration, ready to become someone new. 7 days later, the woman who had once been Grace Mercer sat in an orientation room at the transition center, listening as Dr. Alvarez explained the final phase of the process.
"Your identity establishment is now complete," the doctor was saying. "Your new legal designation is Elaine Foster. Your basic biographical framework, educational background, and social integration parameters have been established in all relevant systems." The woman nodded, absorbing this information with calm interest. The name Elaine Foster felt natural to her, though she had only known it for 3 days. Her memories before the transition center were hazy and general: an unremarkable childhood in a different city, a modest education in administrative management, a life without notable trauma or extraordinary achievement. These implanted memories, carefully constructed by the ministry's identity architects to provide basic psychological continuity without specific attachments, felt genuine to her, though some part of her understood they had been created rather than experienced. "Do you have any questions about your transition completion process?" Dr. Alvarez asked. "When will I be ready for social integration?" Elaine asked. Her voice sounded perfectly familiar to her ears, though it was the same voice that had once belonged to Grace Mercer. "Your community placement is scheduled for tomorrow," Dr. Alvarez replied. "You'll be relocated to Westridge District, where an apartment and entry-level position at a data management firm have been arranged. Transition support services will check in weekly for the first 3 months to ensure successful integration." Elaine nodded again, feeling appropriate appreciation for the system that had given her this fresh start. She had been told that she had volunteered for transition, though the reasons remained appropriately vague in her reconstructed memories, just a general sense of seeking a new beginning without specific motivations. "There's one final protocol to complete before your release." Dr. Alvarez continued, her tone shifting slightly. "A standard verification procedure to confirm complete identity transition." The doctor activated a wall screen which displayed a series of images. People, places, objects. "I'll show you several images. Please indicate if any of them have personal significance to you." Elaine watched as the images appeared in sequence. A university campus, a quantum research laboratory, an apartment in what appeared to be the central district. A man in his mid-30s with dark hair and serious eyes. She studied each image with mild curiosity, but felt no emotional response, no flicker of recognition beyond ordinary observation. "No," she said as the sequence concluded. "None of them seem significant." Dr. Alvarez nodded, making a note on her tablet. "Very good, identity transition is complete with no memory retention from your previous designation." "The man in the images," Elaine said with casual interest. "Who was he?" "A verification subject," Dr. Alvarez replied smoothly. "Part of the standard testing protocol." Elaine accepted this explanation without question. Why wouldn't she? She had no reason to suspect that the man had been Daniel Mercer, that she had once loved him, once built a life with him. No reason to know that just 17 days earlier she had watched him mourn her at her own funeral. "Tomorrow you'll begin your new life as Elaine Foster," Dr. Alvarez said, rising to indicate the session's end. "The transition has been completely successful. You have the rare opportunity that few receive, a genuine fresh start." As Elaine left the orientation room, guided by an attendant toward her temporary quarters for one final night at the center, she felt a sense of anticipation about her future. Tomorrow she would step into the world as Elaine Foster, unburdened by a past she couldn't remember, free to build a new life according to the framework the ministry had created for her. In the Transition Center's administrative wing, Dr. Alvarez updated Grace Mercer's file, officially closing her case with a final notation. "Complete identity dissolution achieved. Subject has successfully transitioned to new designation. Foster Elaine J. with no retained memories of previous identity. Case status closed." Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the memorial gardens where an elegant stone marked the symbolic resting place of his wife, Grace Elizabeth Mercer. The inscription read, followed by her birth date and transition date, below the standard epitaph for transition cases, "Released from one life to enable another." He placed fresh flowers beside the stone, though he knew the gesture was largely for his own benefit. The woman he had loved wasn't here. She wasn't anywhere in any meaningful sense. The body that had housed her consciousness now moved through the world, housing someone else entirely. A stranger named Elaine Foster, according to the minimal information the ministry had provided during his final closure counseling. The counselor had been clear about the protocols: no contact, no monitoring, no attempts to learn about the new identity that occupied what had once been Grace. Transition was absolute and irreversible, the separation complete in every legal, social, and practical sense. "You must think of her as deceased," the counselor had instructed. "The person you knew no longer exists. Attempting to find connection with the new identity would be both illegal and psychologically harmful to both parties." Daniel understood the reasoning. He had attended the mandatory education sessions when Grace first announced her decision, had learned about the importance of clean separation, of treating transition as a form of death rather than a transformation. Yet some stubborn part of him couldn't fully accept that nothing of Grace remained in the woman who now called herself Elaine. Were there moments when something familiar surfaced, a gesture, an expression, a particular way of seeing the world? Did she ever experience unexplained emotional responses to stimuli that had once held meaning for Grace? The transition literature insisted not describe the process as complete erasure, rather than suppression. But the human mind was incomprehensibly complex. Could anyone really be certain that nothing remained? These questions had no answers, at least none that Daniel could access.
The absoluteness of transition, its irreversibility, its finality, was both its greatest promise and its most terrible aspect. Grace had chosen this path, knowing its implications, had willingly surrendered everything she was to escape the guilt that had consumed her. Daniel ran his fingers over the engraved letters of Grace's name, feeling the cool stone beneath his touch. The grief he experienced was complicated by the knowledge that her physical form still existed, still breathed and moved and engaged with the world just without the consciousness he had loved. "I hope you found your peace," he said softly to the empty grave. "Wherever you are now, whatever that even means."
As he turned to leave, Daniel noticed a woman entering the gardens from the opposite gate, a middle-aged mourner carrying flowers similar to his own. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, two people united by the strange, uniquely modern grief of transition loss. The woman nodded in silent acknowledgement before moving toward another memorial stone, another symbolic grave marking a life that had ended while its physical vessel continued. Daniel returned the gesture, feeling a moment of connection in their shared experience of this peculiar form of bereavement mourning. The voluntarily departed, the living dead who walked the same city streets under different names and identities. As he exited the gardens, Daniel glanced back one final time at Grace's memorial. The afternoon sun cast the stone's shadow across the carefully maintained grass, a tangible representation of absence of something that had once been present and now existed only as a negative space defined by what was no longer there. Just like his memories of Grace, which now existed only in his mind and the minds of those who had known her. The woman herself, her consciousness, her continuity of experience had been systematically erased, replaced by someone new who would never know what she had once been. A funeral for the living, a death without dying, a modern miracle, or a technological abomination depending on one's perspective. For Daniel it remained simply a loss, profound and permanent, yet strangely ambiguous in a way that traditional death was not. Somewhere in the city, Elaine Foster was beginning her new life, unaware that she walked in the physical form of a woman whose consciousness had been sacrificed to create the clean slate she now enjoyed. Unaware that she had once been someone else, someone with a history, with achievements, with guilt, with love. Unaware that she had attended her own funeral. If this exploration of identity, memory, and what truly constitutes the self resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more thought-provoking dystopian tales. Would you ever consider a complete memory wipe if it meant escaping unbearable trauma? Is someone still the same person without their memories? Share your thoughts in the comments below.